This is Surface Exposure. Here presents the stories, insights, and efforts of those who interface with the natural world, its inhabitants, resources, and temper. I have found the privilege to speak with Allan Denoyer. Allan is a career archeologist and currently serves with a nonprofit called Archeology Southwest. Archeology Southwest practices preservation archaeology, which is a holistic and conservation-based approach to exploring and protecting heritage places while honoring their diverse values. They compile archaeological information, interpret it, and then share it with the public and decision makers. The organization advocates for landscape-scale protection, serves as stewards for heritage properties and conservation easements, and commits to real ongoing collaboration with indigenous communities. In this episode, Allan illustrates the tools and practices originating from the day-to-day lives of peoples from the past. Allan then tells the story of his passion in recreating ancient technologies, shares his experience as a career archaeologist, and provides resources for listeners interested in becoming further involved in the world of archaeology. Enjoy.
The apple. I don't want the dull apple, because that's got to be tastier. But so that's one of the things it's used for. Another thing it's used for is the coatings on pills. When you take pills, a lot of pills, like, they're chalky and they're nasty, and you stick it in your mouth and it's like,
Uh-huh.
So the lac is that shiny coating that's on those pills. And it's, lac is these insects. They're kind of like aphids. They're very, very tiny. I gotta have like a magnifying lens to practically see them. They're just really, really tiny. But when they're going into their adult stage, they attach themselves to the stem of a plant, and then they suck out the sap, and they process the sap through their biological process in their bodies, and they basically excrete it like poop. But they coat themselves with it, and it dries in this hard shell, this crust over them, and so they form colonies on the branches of some of these plants that are then, through time, the lac just builds up thicker and thicker and thicker, and then you get quite a lot of it on the stems of these plants. And I don't know how long these colonies live, but I think it's years and years and years. And so they're very difficult to find. It takes a while to figure out where to find them. And I don't want to give away all the secrets for it, because I don't want everybody to go out and harvest it all up. When I go out and gather it, I go find where it's at, and I find a colony in a bush, and I'll only cut the dead branches where the colony has died, where the lac is on the branches, but it's no longer active colony, because I don't want to slow down the production of it. I want the colony to keep going. So I found that is an easy way to do it, and it's ecologically correct, not damaging the colony.
Okay. Very interesting. I'm imagining an indigenous person, and whom would that be? Would that be like an Apache or
go further back in time?
Please, yeah.
So like here would be a Hohokam person, an ancestor of the O'odham folks, the folks that live here on the closest to Tucson, or Yaqui, or any one of the groups, any of these groups.
Yeah, can we actually get a rundown on these peoples from this region? Just a high-level general, context for listeners.
The big main ones right around here are going further back in time. You have the folks. Most of these farmer folks probably were coming up from the south. So you have your ancestral Puebloan folks and your O'odham folks coming up from the south back. We know corn agriculture comes in down here over 4,000 years ago.
Okay.
And so agriculture is coming up, and some folks come up and they continue and they go all the way up onto the Colorado Plateau, and then you have the folks that come up and they stay down here in the deserts, and they're moving up along the rivers, and they're bringing corn with them up from down south, and then they're also using all of the natural plants and resources that are available here. You have your mesquite harvest, you have your saguaros, In fact, right now the saguaro fruit harvest is starting. The saguaro. In fact, I just picked my first saguaro fruit this morning out of
Excellent.
my yard. So there are just practically probably 1/3 of all the plants out in the desert are edible in one way, shape, or form, and at some point or another in the year. And so there's a lot of food out there, and these people were all taking advantage of that. There were already people here, and so there's always these sort of archaic populations of folks that were living, hunting, and gathering these resources around. But once these farmers start to come up from the south they're going into the floodplains and they're digging ditches out of the rivers where there's permanent water. They're digging little ditches out into the flat floodplains, and they're planting seeds and they're growing crops. And so they're staying in these places for a much longer periods of time during the seasons.
Okay.
So they probably are still moving around some,
Yeah.
but there may not be like full on staying in the same village year round. But by the time we see ceramics coming in 1,000 years ago, a lot of these villages may be being lived in year round. They may be here full time, and then it just through time, you start out early on. You've got a few people here, a few people there, people kind of moving around, and the population just increases. There's just people. So it gets to points where anywhere that people can grow food or do it, they're there. You'll find villages. The kicker for all of it is water. You got to have water. So it's along the water courses and the drainages where you'll see the most of the evidence for folks that are living for extended periods of time. I guess I didn't touch on so with like we were talking about the lac.
Yes.
So
We continue, please.
Yeah. So with the lac, this when folks used to interpret, you find artifacts that have to be preserved in things like rock shelters and caves and things, because open air sites. The vast majority of archaeological sites are open air. They're not in caves. They're not in rock shelters. They're open air, and so things like lac and wood and leather and all the plants and everything, all the perishable things are gone. So when we find these sites, we're only finding things that are made out of stone, some things made out of bone, and it's like structures. We can find the remnants of houses and all these things. And so lac is one of the things that doesn't preserve in those kinds of sites. So, but to get evidence of it, we find them in like rock shelters and caves. And so a lot of those were excavated back in the late 1800s and early 1900s up on the Colorado Plateau. Basket maker stuff, ancestral Pueblo and stuff. We find those sites up north. And in those sites, there's these artifacts that were collected and sent off to museums all over the place. And then forgotten about. Nothing else was done with it. Some were put on display. Most are just in boxes back in the museums. So people have been going in and going through these collections now, analyzing them, recording what's there and documenting them. And so lac is something they started to notice. Somebody figured out that if you shine a black light on to these artifacts, if it's lac, it'll fluoresce a certain color. And so it's a non-destructive test, and they can do that. And they're discovering that a lot more artifacts are made of lac than anybody realized. And so maybe even that to the point where there was some of the lac is more abundant down in the lower deserts down here than up onto the Colorado Plateau. So maybe there was a trade of some lac up there onto the Colorado Plateau. But as more research is being done, they're discovering plants that have it up there too. So people knew about it, people were using it up there as well. And so the artifacts tend to be things like the foreshafts that you would use with an atlatl and a dart. So the atlatl is the spear thrower. And so this lac is really good for hafting projectile points. I love to use it in my knives. When I'm teaching people how to carve with stone tools, how to carve wood, I haft my blades with it, and it holds them so much better. pine pitch works very well too. I mix pine pitch with, I like to use like deer poop or elk poop that's ground up. It's just ground up plant fibers. I mix that together, melt it together, and I have to, and the pine pitches are what I used to use mostly for all of my stuff, and they work good, but after a while they get brittle, and your bifaces and things will break out of the halves. With lac, it just holds. It just doesn't rot. It doesn't fall apart. We were doing a thing out at the Saguaro, the Desert Museum, with some Park Service employees a few years ago, and I did an atlatl workshop. So we all made atlatls, and they were working on carving them, and they were using these stone knives. Well, a couple of the folks set their knives down out there where we were working, and we forgot about them and left them. And they sat out there for months and months, and these were hafted with the pine pitch. When they finally realized, oh my gosh, we've left these knives sitting here, and gave them back to me, I had to rehaft them because the pine pitch had rotted so bad. It was like chalky, and you could just pull the blades right out of them. So it really showed me how bad, how fast that pine pitch rots.
Huh.
So and the first exposure I ever had to lac was with Bernard Siqueiros, who's a Tono Odom gentleman. He kind of started their he helped work on their cultural heritage museum out by Sells, and his wife, they came in and they did a rattle making class for one of my outreach events, and they used lac to glue the gourd to a saguaro rib, and that was the first time I'd ever seen it. I was like, what? And then it wasn't until later on that a lady over at the U of A came to one of my knife handle classes, and she's like, that was her specialty, was lac. She just got her PhD. Marilyn Poole is her name. She just got her PhD in studying lac insects and their uses in the Southwest. So it's like these people, I don't figure this out. I learn these little tidbits here and there, and then I take it and run with it.
Very interesting. So it's worth the hunt up through the canyon to find this resource.
Yeah, for me, I don't want there to be a lac rush necessarily, but it's definitely it's really fascinating.
And you serve with Archeology Southwest currently.
Yeah,
we're sitting in their building right now. Can you tell me at a high level more about this organization?
So, Archeology Southwest, we are about preserving and protecting archeological resources in the Southwest. And so one of the things we do is we'll purchase archeological sites to put easements on them to protect them so they can never be excavated or developed. And then another aspect is education, teaching people about it. Another aspect we do is data. So we have a part of our organization that Cyber Southwest is called, that goes into site reports and pulls out all the data that archaeologists have collected and compiles it digitally online so that students and archaeologists can go in and use this data for doing studies and research as well. And then advocacy. So we go out and trying to work with Native American communities to do what they would like to do, and to preserve and protect. We got a program going on to try to turn a big area of the Gila Bend into a national monument. So we'd like to get it protected. There's a lot of big rock art sites and big archaeological sites down there that don't have any real protection over them, and so we'd like to see that happen. So we have a number of programs like that we do, and then for me, I do the public outreach, and we run an archaeological field school in the summers where we take college students out and teach them about archaeology.
It seems you're quite involved in that field school. Are you able to tell us more about that?
So in the past, we've run our field school, and this is continuing. We run our field school out of the Upper Gila region in New Mexico. In the past, it's been north of Silver City. We're getting ready to go out in 2 weeks to run this season's field school. And this year, the students are actually going to be staying in Silver City. And they're going to be working out of, or they're going to be working on archeological collections that were dug on sites in the Mimbres Valley. I don't know how many sites, but some sites in the Mimbres Valley to the east of Silver City. And this year is for the first time they're not actually going to be excavating. They're just going to go in and help analyze and process these previously excavated collections. So the Native Americans they're really opposed to us, to all the excavations. And a lot of times it seems that going in to teach students how to dig and digging in these sites that otherwise probably wouldn't be being disturbed, they wouldn't be being messed with. Seems like when you dig a site, you destroy it. So we're going in and we're destroying archaeology, destroying their ancestors' resting places to do this work. And yet we claim to be preservation archaeologists, that we want to preserve and protect archaeology, and yet we're out there digging it. So this year we're not digging, we're moving to this non-excavation mode because there's been so much dug and never analyzed and never looked at. We can go into these museums and we can look at these things and do that analysis, and without having to do the digging and everything. So it's a conundrum because archaeology as a profession is continuing, and the laws of the land say this: if you're going to build a road here and you've got an archaeological site, you have to do the archaeology. You have to do a project on it, especially if it's got government funds involved, like a infrastructure, a highway, a sewer plant, anything like that. You have to do the work. And so somehow or another, these students have to be trained. So we're doing everything we can up to the excavation stuff right now. So with the students, we'll learn how to analyze the artifacts, what they are, how to analyze them, that kind of stuff. And then they will also learn archaeological survey, and that's where you go out on the landscape and you walk transects, and you look for artifacts on the surface. And when you find them, you map those areas, you record them, you document them. And these places where you see artifacts on the surface we call archeological sites. And sometimes these sites are just on the surface, the artifacts are just on, but sometimes they're subsurface, there's pit houses, there's all kinds of stuff. You don't know what's subsurface in most cases, because we don't go out and dig holes to see, like, what's down here, what's here. But we know enough about all these sites having been worked on in this region that if you find these things, there's a super high chance that you have subsurface.
You're using indicators, or
yeah, like the amount of artifacts on the surface, and the types of artifacts. Like if you just have a bunch of sherds, you could find a spot where you just have like 30 or 40 sherds on the surface. They're just pieces of a broken pot. That's where somebody could have been carrying a pot full of water coming from a spring or something and dropped it, and it broke. And those are the sherds from that pot. It's all one pot. So that spot, you're not likely going to have subsurface. That's just a single incident in time, a pot drop. But you go to a site where you've got flakes, you chip stone, like from them making tools and flake tools, and you have pottery sherds, and you have dark, dirty, ashy stained soil with charcoal and ash, and fire cracked rocks from cooking and stuff going on. You have all these things over the site. That's a spot people were living, and people built pit houses. So they would dig a hole in the ground, and they would build a structure out of the hole, and the dirt they dug to build the hole, they would lump up on the roof. They'd make it in mud and put it on the roof. And so those are subsurface. Those are buried. So they have either burned down or they rotted and collapsed, and the holes have filled in. So on the surface, you can't see those anymore. But when you have this range of artifacts that you can see on the surface, it tells you, oh, yeah, there's something there. and artifacts are super important for us. And it's one of the reasons why we discourage people from going out and picking up artifacts and say, oh, this would look great on my mantle. Because artifacts, where they are on the landscape, tell you who was there and when. So if you find, and for certain artifacts are much more beneficial for archaeologists because they're more time sensitive. They're made a certain way at a certain period of time. And pottery is a really big one. So the time periods that people were making pots, they would paint them with designs. And through time, these designs change. And so having excavated and worked on all these sites, when we see certain types of pottery with certain styles of design on them, we know roughly the age that they were made. You know, and sometimes it can be short increments, like a 10-year increment, or sometimes it's like a 50-year or a 100-year increment that this type of pottery is made. But it's still better than nothing. And then the further back in time you go earlier than pottery, we don't have as many things that are as easy to tell. But one thing is the lack of pottery. If you're on a site and there's flakes and there's fire-cracked rock, but there's no pottery, we know it's probably earlier. And then in those time periods, they were using different tools. So the bow and arrow comes in around the same time as pottery. So we start to see little tiny, little bitty arrowheads at that time period. But you go earlier than that, they're making much larger projectile points or arrowheads. Those points we can easily identify, and the way they make them is a little different. So we have a different set of trash of the debris from making them that's on those sites. So we can recognize that. And then, but for what's really cool is through time, the way people made their projectile points changes. And so people living in a certain culture at a certain period of time, everybody made their points the same way. And then through time, that gradually changes. And so what we can do is we find a certain style of point. We say, this is a San Pedro. This is 2,000 to 2,500 years old. So it tells us roughly who was there and when. It's really cool. And so but if somebody's coming along, and a lot of people love to hunt projectile points and artifacts. So you come along, oh, look at this cool projectile point, and you pick it up. No, neat, cool, I can take this. And you take it home and put it on your mantle, and then eventually ends up in a jar somewhere, and it loses its context. The context, the place where that was found, tells us who was there and when. So when you pick them up and you take it away from there, it loses its context, which is, half its value or more. 75% of its value is where it came from, for what it tells you about who was there and when. It's pretty cool.
You're really good at illustrating that context, which, for me sitting here listening to your story, is super valuable and draws that and builds that connection between me, who is not super knowledgeable on a lot of the material you're talking about, but to hear your story makes that value. And as I understand, the practices of archaeology are changing, such as you're no longer digging as much to practice preservation archaeology.
Yeah, that would be like sort of specific to us,
right?
To Archeology Southwest.
Okay, tell me.
But
okay.
Archaeology itself
okay.
is not necessarily changing as far as excavations go. So excavations are ongoing and continuing and will continue.
Okay. And so it's Archeology Southwest is participating in doing no-dig archaeology and doing preservation archaeology.
Yes.
And so
yes.
that means you'll have other skills to present and make it valuable.
Yeah.
What skills make a good preservation archaeologist?
I think I don't know that it needs any specific skills any different than any archaeologist anywhere.
Okay.
Just paying attention.
And what are these? What are they?
The big one for us is for preservation archaeology is getting over that urge to solve a problem by digging a site, to get over that urge of I want to learn. Archaeologists like to come up with like theories or ideas like so.
Okay.
I want to learn now why they did this at this period. I want to know why they lived in these places. And so, but in order to do that, I want to go look at one of those sites. I'm going to go dig that site, and then I'm going to dig a site in another place that's different than that. And I'm going to see if I can see any differences in what's in those sites. And maybe that'll tell me why they were here and not and here. And it might give me an idea what's going on with that. So our goal is to have people say, I want to learn, I want to see this difference, but instead of going out and digging sites, new sites, I'm just going to go in and look at existing sites and reanalyze those collections and see if I can find the data in that. But here's where the problem lies, is that archaeological techniques for excavations have changed through time.
Okay.
And so stuff that we think is important now, when people were first starting to do archaeology, they didn't think was important, and they didn't collect, and they didn't document. So the more we learn, the more we learn about the people in the past, the more stuff is important that's in the sites. Does that make sense? More so, and as technology changes, we can do more and more with stuff. So it may reach a point where we don't have to dig. We can take an instrument and we can scan the surface of the ground, and it can interpret all kinds of things like that are in the soil. Like I'm getting a little Star Trek-y, but potentially like these people, we can tell from all the different organics that are in this dirt that these people were growing corn, and that they were using all these different resources, and that's just from the I don't want to say DNA, but the stuff that's in the soil, the organics in the soil.
Yeah.
We can look at like copper lights, like where you find in rock shelters and things. You can find turds, and you can look at those and you can tell what people are eating. You can say this is this, and you can see that they ate this. But a lot of that same information that's in that can actually be found in the soil, and people are getting better and better at testing that. It's kind of like I look at a little bit like back when COVID was going around everywhere, and they weren't doing a lot of testing, but they would test like in sewer systems, like outside of big apartments, like at the U of A over here, they could do these tests in the sewers outside of the big apartment buildings, and they could tell, there's a lot of COVID going on here by the amount of it going through the system, that's going through people and coming out their other side and going out the sewer. So they could say, there's COVID is rampant right now, even though there's not a lot of testing going on. You can't see it that way, but you can see it, from what's left behind. And if that illustrates it very well or not, but it's kind of that thing, and we're always getting better at it. We learn more and more from less and less.
Yeah, more than just digging.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of time recreating the ancient technologies or tools that peoples from the past would use in their day-to-day lives. What are the greatest insights or lessons that you gain in this process? Or do you have any? Go ahead. Yeah.
I would say that people weren't primitive. People, they're the same as us. We're no different now than people were in the past. The only thing that's changed is the technologies. But people could do anything they wanted to do with stone tools. Stone tools are not a primitive thing. You can do anything with them. I really enjoy carving with stone tools, with stone knives, and it works different. You just have to turn things in your head to I can't do it like I would do it with a modern saw, but I can use a stone knife as a saw, and it works. I have to do a few little things slightly different, and it might take a little bit longer, but it's not that much. So you just have to put yourself in this perspective that you can do it, you know. So if you practice a little bit, it just gets easier and easier and easier to do. And that's like with everything, you know. And so I think the big thing is that people were just the same as us. People had the same mental capacities, had all the same everything. In fact, they had to know more than we have to know. You know, to plant your corn, you have to know. You know, you don't have, in North America, nobody had written records. It was all stories. People told stories. When you see this tells you this is time to plant. Like the Odom folks down here, when it was time to plant the corn is when the mesquites start popping their new buds, their new leaves. When you see the mesquites popping their new leaves, it's time to plant your corn. So it's things like that. But that right now is changing because of global warming, because these summers are getting so hot when you plant your corn. By the time your corn is sending out the spikes to pollinate, to do the pollination process, the weather's so hot it doesn't work right. And so it's hard to get your corn to pollinate right. When the weather is over 100 degrees, it doesn't pollinate right. So, you know, now it's like, now what do? Do we move it planting back further so that it's cooler when the corn tassels? It's really fascinating to see these changes, you know, and how it affects everything. How it, you know, like something as simple as the mesquites when they leaf out. What a great thing that people knew. If I plant it at this time, it always works. And now, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't work so well. You know, it's fascinating. It's super fascinating.
What's your favorite thing to make?
I love to flint now, to make stone, like knives and projectile points, arrowheads, that kind of thing. I just love it.
I read one of your blog posts on the internet talking about your flint knapping story, and you acquired the interest many years ago back in a summer camp you attended as a child.
Yeah. I was lucky. So when I was a kid, it started out with, when I was a kid, my dad used to talk about, he'd go up in the hills. I grew up in Colorado, up in kind of central Colorado, a little town called Salida. And Dad would talk about when he was a kid, he'd go hiking up in the hills around where we lived, and he would find, we knew they weren't dinosaur, but he would find mammal bones, fossilized mammal bones coming out of the hills. And so, and he talked about how he always wanted to find a saber-toothed tiger, tooth or skull or whatever, you know. And I'm like, oh, me too. I want to find one of those. So I go hiking around in these eroding clay hills, you know, hiking. And I started to find bones. I figured out how to find these bones that were eroding out. And one day I came across a spot and I found all these bones, and there were these little pieces of jaws and all this stuff, bones coming out. And I didn't know any better. I was digging them out, and I'm just pulling out, like, there were probably whole jaws in there, and I'm just pulling the pieces out. Like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
A friend of the family happened to be the state geologist in Colorado. So he would come up and he would elk hunt with us. And so he was in around or whatever, and so I showed him these bones I had found. He was like, oh, let me take some of these up. I know a paleontologist up in Boulder. So he took them up and showed them to this guy, and the guy's like, oh, these are really cool. And it was to a species of antelope that they don't have a complete skeleton. They never found a complete skeleton of them before. So he's like, I'd like to come out and look at that spot and maybe do a little dig, whatever, and check it out. So they came out and did a dig on that spot, and I was like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to be a paleontologist, blah, blah, blah. You know, so they did the dig, and I had dug everything up already. I had just rooted through it, and there was no complete skeletons or anything. And he ended up leaving the bones. I still have the bones to this day. But it was like a year or two later, an employee at our greenhouses got a thing about a camp, a summer camp that was opening up over near Cortez called Crow Canyon Archeological Center. And it was a junior high field school, and so I'm like, I want to do it, and I had to work and make the money to go, but I did. I went and did this junior high field school at Crow Canyon, and they were excavating in a Pueblo I site there, and it was a bunch of archaeologists, and one of the archaeologists that was doing it, his name is Bruce Bradley. Bruce Bradley grew up in Tucson here, actually, but he's an amazing flint napper. And Dad and I had seen a Nova, which had him on it, demonstrating how to make Clovis points, how the prehistoric folks made Clovis points. So he worked there, and I was just like, that's it. That's what I want to do. You know, I want to be a flint napper. I want to do that, you know, and I did. I just kept doing it. My whole life I've been doing that, and doing archaeology, because it was like, that's it. I love it, you know, and I have. I cannot complain. I've had the best career a boy could possibly have.
Can you tell us more about it? Where have you served? How have you served as an archaeologist?
Well, when I started, I worked at Crow Canyon all through my high school years. Okay. So I went as a student, and then they hired me because I was so enthusiastic. So they hired me, and I worked at the sites, but I also worked in housekeeping and, you know, keeping the lodges clean and picking people up from there. So I did all that. And then a number of the folks there worked in there, not during the winter months and stuff. They lived down here in Tucson, and convinced me to come down here. So I went to Pima Community College down here, and so I met archaeologists there, and I took classes there, and then I got a job working for one of the contract archaeology firms here in Tucson, and I ended up never finishing my Pima College career. I don't even have my bachelor's degree. I just loved the working out in the field so much, and I was good enough that they would hire me without having a degree. So I made my career working without having a degree for all these companies, but I was good enough that they would let me go out. I could almost pick my projects, so I would work on you know, anything. I was particularly fond of the early agricultural period stuff. And at that time, we were working on all these sites. Every other site we worked on, we were pushing corn back further in time. When I first started, when I was at Pima, everybody assumed corn agriculture came in, you know, about 1,500 years ago, something like that. Okay. And we would dig these sites in the floodplain. We realized, oh, there's all these sites in the Santa Cruz floodplain. So we'd work on these sites, and there are all these layers in the Santa Cruz floodplain. And so we consecutively, we just keep going deeper, and we keep finding layers of stuff. And so we go deeper and deeper. And over the years, we just kept pushing back the earliest dates on corn and pushing it back. And so now, up at Los Pozos, or Los Capas, I should say, this is a site that's up kind of I-10 in the interstate area. It's underneath everything up there. It's this huge site. And there's dates on corn that are over 4,000 years now. And it will go more. But the further back in time, the harder it is to find the earliest stuff. And we're getting so deep with those early corn dates, we're getting so deep in the floodplain that we have perched water tables where the height of the water in the Santa Cruz River was so high that the water table was up in those areas. And that's where you get that heavy caliche.
Okay.
And so where that caliche is at, when we get into that caliche, we can't see anything. It's all caliche. It's like, so the only time we can see features and things in those areas is when, like, we're digging along with the backhoe and we hit a pit that has like groundstone in it, like monos and metates and things like that. We hit that, it's like, oh, look at these things, and they're in this caliche. And we can't see the pit, we can't see the outline of the pit, we can just see where the artifacts are at. So, and then carbon, like that we date for those areas, for those features, is gone. The water just rots and gets flushed out of the system, so we can't date anything in those areas. So the further you go back in time in the Santa Cruz floodplain, it's harder to date it. It's a challenge.
Okay.
I get sidetracked.
Yeah, I love it. I know that I don't know that much or enough about your topic to even come up with great questions regarding like the vast amounts of information that you deal with, but I am curious what it looks like to serve as a contract archaeologist. Like, what do your missions look like? What are the interests? What are the goals? What information are you looking for? Where is it going?
It's one of those things that has changed through time.
Yeah.
But and it also kind of varies from company to company what their interests are. So one of the companies that I worked for the most here in Southern Arizona was Desert Archeology.
Okay.
And Desert was pretty good. They before a project, and a lot of these companies do this. You come up with a research design.
Okay.
So what do we want to learn? What is something that we'd like to help to figure out that we can help us understand what was going on prehistorically better. And so you come up with this research design, and then you come up with stuff that you're gonna concentrate on in your excavations. You're gonna collect. You're gonna look at. You're gonna spend a lot of time on. You're gonna take a lot of more samples of dirt in these locations to see if you can find evidence of certain things in that dirt, or like the shape of the pit houses, or there's just a million different research design topics you can address. And then the other one is basically it's just flat out straight, just documenting what's there. So in most cases where, like, especially like along the interstate or along in some of the sewer plants and things here in Tucson where we're working, the place is going to get destroyed after we're there. They're going to come in and they're going to dig it out, and what we're looking at is going to be gone.
Okay.
There's going to be nothing left. So we go in and we excavate the houses and we draw maps of them, and we record where we find the artifacts in them, and all those artifacts are labeled that have their context, where they came out of these houses. And so if somebody wanted to come back later on and look at some other aspect out of these materials, they can go look at the maps, and they can look at the artifacts and say, when they did this, they didn't understand that these artifacts were being used for this purpose. And so now we keep learning. Sometimes we'll find that there's interpretations of artifacts that are completely wrong. They're not what we thought they were. They're actually used for this other process, or they're used in a different way.
Sure.
And that's one way where the experimental archaeology that I do can help answer those questions too, by coming in and using these artifacts and saying, we've always interpreted this artifact as for an example, there's a type of artifact called, we used to call them Gavi knives. And so they're a tabular rock, they're flat, they're very thin,
okay.
And then on one edge they're ground to a sharp edge, and they're often serrated. And there were examples of these we would find that sometimes on the other side, on the other end, there'd be little holes drilled in them, or there'd be little tabs, little rectangular pieces that stick off each side, and these were made to be hafted onto handles. And so they were interpreted as Agavi knives, and I think that's pretty accurate, pretty correct. So if you've ever used an agave, if you've ever cut up an agave, so people used agaves, they would grow. Out in Marana here, there are massive agave fields. People would go out and they would pile up a pile of rocks, and they would plant the agave pups into these rocks. The rocks help hold in the moisture, and it creates a habitat more like their natural habitat along canyon walls, sides where the agaves grow. So they create these agave planting fields, and so out there in Marana, there's hundreds of millions of them. Well, not hundreds of millions, but there's thousands and thousands of them. There's tons of them, and so we find these agave knives here and there. But when they go to harvest them, would be in the early spring. People go to harvest these things, so when the agaves start to put up their stalks to bloom. So people would go out with these agave knives and cut off that stalk when it's just starting to grow. You cut the stalk off, and then the plant is stuck. The bulb, the bottom of the plant, is loaded with sugars because they grow that stalk in a matter of a couple weeks. They just shoot up like a piece of asparagus. Boom. And so when you cut that stalk off, the plant is loaded with this sugar, and it's just like, oh no, you basically just killed it, because they only bloom once and then they die. And so, but by cutting that stalk off, the plant's not using those sugars, and then you can use that you could go in and dig that bulb out, and then they would roast them. They would dig big pits, or medium-sized pits, whatever. They dig these big pits, and they build a fire in there with all these rocks, heat it, get it really hot, put the bulbs in there, and then build another fire over the top, and then let these things roast and cook in this pit, probably for days. And then it just makes it just roasts those sugars that are in that plant into this delicious nectar fruit. So then they would harvest them, and then they would ferment it and probably make kind of sort of alcoholic beverages and eat the parts of it too. So it was a big industry going on out in the Marana area. So when you're harvesting these agaves, if you've ever been around agaves, they have all the thorns on the ends of their leaves and things. So these knives that they made would be hafted onto handles that they could stand outside of the edge of the thorns, and with those thin edges and serrated edges, they would saw the leaves off. If you come at an angle, you can saw them off. So the old interpretation of calling them knives, I think they should be called saws, agave saws, because they're used more like a saw. But they work really nice. We played with them a little bit down at Mission Gardens, cutting some agave up, and they work just fine. And you don't get that agave juice before it's cooked. It's very acidic, and you get that on your hands, and your hands will crack and bleed, and it's really awful. So you don't want to get it on your hands. So the agave knife make perfect sense. They're wonderful in that way. So,
what are some other foods from those indigenous foods that you enjoy?
I love saguaro fruit.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I've never had one. You were just talking about it. It's the season, huh?
Yeah, it's just, in fact, I have down in my truck right now, I have a little basket. I harvested some this morning.
Oh, wow.
So I got another staff member who's never had it. So when we're done here, I'll bring some up.
Oh, exciting. Fun.
Yeah.
Where did you go after you were doing contract work like that?
I've worked contract archaeology my whole career, and then kind of when that ended, I came over here to Archeology Southwest.
Okay.
Since I've been at Archeology Southwest, I haven't been really a contract archaeologist anymore.
Okay.
I have jumped off a couple times and gone and worked on digs, but for the most part, I don't. I just do this public outreach archaeology full time.
Okay. Let's talk more about that public outreach here at Archeology Southwest. How do you function here then?
So I came on here, the first thing that I came on here and did when I started, and it wasn't even that I was going to be here that long, but it was to build a pit house, a replica of a prehistoric house that people lived in. So we built one. It's a replica of a Hohokam style house, something probably about 700-800 years old now. We built it. It was based on houses that were excavated at Honeybee Village, which is located up in Rancho Vistoso, up in Oro Valley. And so we built this house down at Steam Pump Ranch there in Oro Valley. Steam Pump Ranch, it's an old ranch that it was the first ranch that had one of these steam-driven pumps that they brought it in on the railroad when the railroad came in, and so they could bring the water up. And so it was a stopping station for ranchers that lived over on the San Pedro River. They'd bring their herds over, and it was a watering stop for them to water their cattle before they brought them on into Tucson to the railroad to ship them east. They would ship a lot of the cattle back east to be used. So, but Steam Pump Ranch came really close to getting developed, to being gone, but they've saved it. The Oro Valley Historical Society managed to save it just in the nick of time. And so a gal I knew who worked there, Joyce, decided they run a summer camp in there for kids, and there wasn't a lot of shade. So she thought a pit house would be really cool for the kids to be able to go into and learn about that. So I was brought on to go help build a pit house out there. Because I'm always making things, and I've built pit houses before down here during the Rio Nuevo project. I was building these little pit houses. And so they brought me on to build that, and I never left. I've been there ever since.
Wow.
And so then we developed, through the course of that, we developed this hands-on program. We call it hands-on archaeology. So I go to Steam Pump Ranch on second Saturdays over the fall, winter, and spring months. And then now we've expanded to, I do programs on fourth Saturdays at Mission Gardens. That's where you came down that day. You're doing all that hide stretching. So I go out and do these outreaches, and I try to have activities that people can take part in. So like when you were there, we were stretching a deer hide. We were making buckskin, and we're doing part of that process. I have a lot of different ones that I do, and I'm always trying to come up with more, which sometimes it's challenging, but if I'm trying to come up with new ideas, all I really need to do is just go look at artifacts and say, wow, this artifact, I've always wondered how they used it and what they do with it. And in fact, I just had a blog post come out this week that's on shaft straighteners.
Okay.
It's a rock that has, they're little sort of rectangular rocks, maybe about 3 inches by 2 inches, something like that. And some of them have a kind of a raised ridge running down the middle. And then parallel to that are 2 grooves, deep grooves that run sideways across through the rock. And they've always been called shaft straighteners, but I've never used them. I never really understood how they worked. And I read an article about it. It's like, okay. But it never really made sense until I made a couple of them this last winter and started playing with them. And they work fantastic. They work so good because you heat them in a fire. You take that little rock and you put it in a fire and you get it really, really hot. And then you pull it out with a couple sticks, or I've been cheating using metal tongs and pulling them out, and I set them on another rock or whatever, and then you take your shaft that you want to straighten, whatever it is, wood you've got that has got curves and things in it, you lay that into those notches, those grooves, and you flex the ends, and that heat in that rock, it just pumps the heat into the wood, and it causes the cell structure in the wood to make it bend easily, and it sort of makes the cell structure forget its shape, the shape of the branch, or the piece of wood. And so you flex it the other way past where the bend is. Say the bend's like this, you put it in and you flex it the other way, and then it'll release a little bit, but it'll come back to straight. So you just work your sticks up and down those grooves, straightening them and rubbing them and straightening them, and you can just straighten an arrow shaft out, just like a breeze. It works really nice.
A shaft straightener.
And sometimes you'll have a one you want to use. You'll have a stick you want to use, and there'll be a spot where there was a knot or something, and there's a pretty sharp bend in it.
Yeah.
And those are really hard to straighten. But the raised grooves on the shaft straightener, it's a little area of rock that sticks above the face of it. It's a little bit higher. You can stick that the bend part of that on that groove and that rock. It just sends the heat into that one isolated little spot, and then because it's higher up, you can flex it even more. And you can straighten those little crooks out really easily. And it's just like, makes perfect sense. It's
That's
like, wow,
fascinating.
People figured this out.
That's fascinating.
And it works like a dream, you know? So, I'm like,
that's
wow.
Fascinating. Where do you find resources and information on recreating these tools of the past?
There's a lot of resources. Like right now on the internet, there's tons of people that have videos out on flint knapping. Okay. I have some on our website that I've put out, but others have them. There's tons of websites. There's books that are out there that you can buy. You can Google. You know, like if you want to tan a hide, you Google hide tanning, you know, or whatever, and there's tons of books and things you can buy, like on Amazon for it, that are great. They're really good resources. You can have one of those, and you can save yourself a lot of heartbreak, you know, of messing stuff up.
Yeah, and one doesn't need tons of upfront materials or equipment to start recreating some of these ancient technologies.
Yeah. So say flint knapping for
Right.
one is like there's two worlds in it. There's
Okay.
there's the worlds that I use all primitive tools, so to
Mhm.
speak. I use deer antlers
Okay.
and sandstone cobble rocks for my
Okay.
hammerstones. But there's a lot of folks out there that do it that they use modern tools. So you can use copper instead of antler. You can use copper, and a lot of people use copper tools to do it with.
Okay.
There's some evidence that it was done with copper in a few places, but overall, generally speaking, it wasn't done with copper very much. But still, the copper tools can help a person learn pretty fast. And so you can go online and you can order tools that are already pre-made from somebody, or you can find tutorials on how to make the tools that you want. Antlers are another problem. People want to use antler tools to flint knap. They're harder to find. But living here in Tucson, you can go to the gym show, and there's always dealers down at the gym show that are selling antlers that have been gathered in Montana and Wyoming and places like that. And they're a tad bit pricey, but it's as easy as even that. If you really are desperate to find tools in a hurry to do it or whatever, you can go to places like PetSmart and you can buy antlers there that they cut up for dog chew treats
Okay.
and things. But these antlers are mostly pretty good. So you can
What are you
find-
doing with the antler as the tool to?
So with a deer antler, so when you're flint knapping, I have the rocks I use initially, or through a large part of the process to strike flakes with to hit my piece of rock. So we'll say a piece of obsidian.
Okay.
So I have my piece of obsidian is the rock that is being struck, and when you hit it, you're knocking off what we call flakes. So obsidian is high in silica, and it breaks with conchoidal fracture, and so because of that, I can control it. So if it's on an angle less than 90 degrees, if I hit the edge, if I set the edge up right and I hit it, I can knock a flake. So you may have seen a window that's been hit by a BB,
Yeah.
and you get a cone that pops out. So that's conchoidal fracture. So, but you can't control that. That takes so much force on a thicker rock to knock a cone, and it's not a great shape for a tool.
Yeah.
But if you take a rock and you hit it on an edge that's less than 90, you knock what we call a flake, and a flake is a half of a cone. And so it's the energy enters the rock, and then it spreads out and it follows the surface contour of the rock, and it breaks off whatever shape that might be. And you can control that shape. You can set it up by striking other flakes to get the shape you want. And so it's that process of striking these flakes. And then once you get a nice flake, you can strike flakes off of it and flake it into what we call a biface. And then you can finish those off with a process called pressure flaking. And it's where you take the other end of the deer antler, the tine, the sharp end, you take that and you put it on the edge and you push off smaller flakes. And that's how you get that really nice straight edges and then nice flaking along the margins. And you could make notches or whatever style you want to make.
Yeah.
And so and then you have in the modern guy's world, in the world, you can do all of that with copper tools. There's copper boppers where they've got copper. You take an end cap to a copper pipe and you fill it with lead, and then you glue it to a stick, and you make like an antler percussion tool, like the base of the antler that I use. We call them billets. You make a copper version of one of those. And then the pressure flaker, you put a copper rod into a wood dowel or something like that, and then you can pressure flake, just like with the deer antler tine. Push the flakes off.
Cool. Very cool. What's a good first project for somebody interested in this?
Oh, there's so many things. Like, there's so many worlds in it. So you can you can do cordage. Pottery is a big one. There's a guy here in town, Andy Ward, who teaches how to make primitive pottery. He does a fantastic job with that. There's the flint knapping. There's what else? I mean, there's a million things. You can make axe, like you can make a stone axe by pecking a rock.
Yeah.
But for first projects, you pick something simple. for a first project to go in Canna High is not a good idea.
Okay.
You'll be sad. It's so much work. It's so hard. So start small. Take a class that somebody's teaching somewhere on it, or get online and research it up. You know, it's like, what is your interest? So you got to pick something you're interested in, and then you can find something on it.
Yeah, there's an ancient solution for it, right?
Yeah.
They were the same people, just like us.
Yep.
Just different tools.
Yep. Yeah. One of the classes that I do a lot of like make jewelry, like either shell or stone. So I've gathered a lot of like soapstone rocks and things like that. So like yesterday when we were up on Mount Lemon with the Tona Autumn youth doing this camp, they all got to sit down and play with these little slabs. I cut them out on my tiles, so I cheat, but I cut them out so they can sit down with these little slabs and grind them on a sandstone slab, shape them, and then I have stone drills, and they can drill the holes in them with the stone drills with their hands. And it's just a stick with like an arrowhead on the end, but it's really pointy, like a drill, and they drill the holes in them, and it's super easy. So that's always a good kind of thing. Find something easy and simple, and go from there. Or there's people that teach classes on harvesting wild plants around town, or go to Mission Gardens and talk to people there, and go look at the native gardens there. They've got people that teach you how to harvest these things. It's really cool.
Yeah, maybe I can put together a list of various resources I will post in the show's notes for anybody that would be interested in some of the stuff we've talked about. I did hear you mention a few times your program at Steam Pump Ranch and Mission Garden.
Yeah.
Can you tell me just a little bit more about those two events? It's a place where we're going to find you doing what we're talking about. Yeah.
So I'll be there starting next fall again. We'll be at those locations. Second Saturday, so every second Saturday of each month, I will be at Steam Pump Ranch. Pretty much clockwork. But if I can't make it, I'll have a volunteer that'll be there. We'll have something going on, hopefully.
Yeah, what kind of stuff we got going on there?
So at Steam Pump, you can see this pit house that we've built. And the pit house is often in various stages of weathering. Sometimes it's we've worked on it and it's really great, and other times I've neglected it and it's gotten rained on and it's weathered down. Yeah. So sometimes one of the activities will be making mud out there. We'll have people come by, they can jump in and make mud and help smear it on the walls of the structure.
Oh, cool!
And fix it up. We did a video for Archeology Southwest. It's pretty recently out, like it's maybe been out a month. And it's just kind of an overview of what we do, and it's narrated by an NPR guy. But it's there's pictures of little kids smearing mud on the pit house.
That's cool.
There at Steam Pump. That's really cool.
That's fun.
And then same thing down at Mission Gardens, we have a pit house there that from time to time we'll be working on as well and smearing mud on it. I've kind of neglected it a little bit lately, but it's earlier time period style pit house. But you can go into it and you can get a feel for what it might have felt like to be in one of these houses or to live in them. And then we have a third pit house here in Tucson too, that's at the Presidio Museum over here. And I really like how it turned out. It's my most recent one, and it really fits my mental vision of what these pit houses would have looked like from the Cienega time period. So that time period, we're going back about 1,500 years ago, give or take 500 years to the earlier, or maybe a little bit on either side. All these dates are very fuzzy. We've got dates. We don't know when it started exactly where, but at that period of time, people are building round pit houses. And they're digging them down into the ground, and then they have post holes all the way around the outside, and they're like using willows, and they're sticking them on the outside and bending them over and tying them off of the top. So it's kind of like this unfinished structure looks an awful lot like what you imagine like African huts look like. A lot of people have visions of these round structures that are with grass and stuff. Well, these would have had probably mud on the roofs. The domed roofs would have been covered with a little layer of mud, and then there would have been an entryway into them along the side. Archaeologically, we can't tell where those entryways are because they're not dug into the ground. They're above the ground surface, so they're just going through the side of the structure. So we don't know exactly where. But that time period is pre-pottery, so they're not making pottery yet. But it's a really fascinating time period because it's when the bow and arrow comes in. So earlier on, they're making larger projectile points, and then towards the end of it, they're making very small little arrow points. And so it's showing this transition, the bow and arrows coming in. And then the next phase, the next thing we see is the houses become rectangular. Again, they were rectangular earlier than this. Houses start to become rectangular, and we see ceramics. The first pottery is coming in. And in these houses, the pottery, in these sites, the pottery tends to be these seed jars. They're just jars with no necks, just a round hole in the top of them. And then the next vessel, the pottery type that comes in, is a bowl or bowls. And these bowls oftentimes were put over the top of those holes, so they're kind of like lids. So it's like, are they made as a bowl or are they being made as a lid for these seed jars? It's kind of interesting. It's pretty cool.
Ooh, concerning.
I once again went on a tangent.
Oh, I love it. We love stories. What are some unanswered questions in the realm of your interest, your concerns, your work? What are some unknowns that you dance around? You've been.
Well, there's a lot of things like migrations, like so that Cienega time period I was just talking about, like when Cienega period, when we start finding these round houses, are those round houses, do they represent are they being made by the same people as the earlier San Pedro folks that were here, that were living in more rectangular houses? Or do they represent a group of folks that's moving up here from the south, a new migration of people up through? These Cienega folks, a lot of their artifacts and stuff look very similar to some of this basket maker stuff up on the Colorado Plateau. Real similar, And so Cienega's here for quite a while, and then it kind of disappears. So is it because they just continue migrating on up, or do they kind of assimilate into the local San Pedro folks that are still here? Are they separate? There's a lot. We just have this sort of fuzzy picture. We're looking through a very muddy window at the stuff, and so we see things that we interpret it this certain way. But it could be a completely different game that's going on that we just don't understand. So everything's important, it's like we've dug a lot of pit houses, we've dug a lot of these things, but you never know what the next bit of information is going to show that we don't understand,
Yeah, that can change. Yeah, the new piece of information comes and changes that fuzzy image and shatters it and shakes it.
And we have to understand that we're looking at everything through our cultural lenses. We look at this and we see this thing this way. But that's why going to the Native Americans and talk to them about it, they look at it and they see it a completely different way. And so what we think it means is not what it means. It actually means something completely different.
What are some of the greatest misconceptions that our society provides?
I don't really know if I can answer that.
What's a pet peeve of yours? What's one that you hear commonly?
Well, I guess the one, one of the really monstrous dumb ones is that, where did these people go? You hear Anasazi, which is an old word, which is an awful word. It's basically the ancestral Puebloans. You hear this, that they disappeared, like the people at Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde or up there at the Four Farms. Everybody just disappeared. Well, that's not true. They're still here. The modern pueblos are their ancestors, and they're still living in very similar structures in very similar ways. But there's this broad misunderstanding that they disappeared and nobody knows what's happened to them, this big mystery. And it's kind of the same with the Hohokam down here. It's like, we don't know who they were or where they went. You know, they just disappeared. But they're still here. The O'odham groups, the Tono O'odham, the Salt River, the Gila River groups up in Phoenix.
Yeah.
All these groups, all these people, they're their ancestors. They're still here. And they have stories about a lot of these places. You know, and these stories match up with what we see archaeologically. If you look at them through their cultural lens, you know, it's like, oh yeah, that this story is talking about this village over here, and it, you know, it makes sense.
What are the mechanisms?
Colonialism?
Yeah,
I don't know.
is that...
You know, I think it's this thought that you go to this place and you don't see any of the people there. So there was a massive population crash when prior to and around the time the Spanish came in. You know, all these diseases went through, and villages that had hundreds of people were down to 2 or 3. You know, I mean, like families and everything just crashed, and people telescoped together into these places, and they were living so. By that time, they weren't building as structures that were nearly as big, or as they didn't have the manpower or time to put into building things that were so as impressive as the stuff that we see earlier on. So people would see these folks living out here, and they're like, "There's no way these people could be the people that built this." You know what I mean? They're just like, these people are living in grass huts over here. They couldn't have built Casa Grande ruins. You know, they couldn't be the same people. And so it's this sort of it's something you see today in a lot of these conspiracy theories stuff. You know, people are like, ancient aliens. There's no way people could do this. You know, the pyramids were built by aliens and da 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 da. But people are ingenious, and we don't need aliens to explain how all these things were done. We don't need that kind of like, well, if you don't understand how somebody did something, so you jump to this completely this theory that you have no evidence for, and you just run with it, you know, and that's dramatic and exciting, and everybody jumps on board with that, but there's no evidence. That's where archaeology's been really good. You know, we dig these sites and we record what we find, you know, and there'll be people like, well, there's all this evidence that people were coming up from Mesoamerica and doing all this stuff. Well, there's not. There's a little teeny bit of evidence for some stuff, but it's not like big, massive amounts of folks coming from way down south bringing their technologies up here. The Hohokam had ball courts. They did this ball court thing, and it's in a lot of their sites that we have these ball courts, 1 or 2 ball courts in the bigger villages and such. And then, you know, about halfway through their time period, they stop doing the ball courts and they start doing other things. But the ball courts probably share a commonality to the ones down south that they were doing further down in Mesoamerica. They probably have a similar kind of origins, but these guys are up here and they're way out of it, and they probably weren't doing the same things with them exactly. In fact, you talk to Native Americans today, they're more like, well, these ball courts are more like dance floors. They're social gathering places. You know, it may not have been about they're playing this game and it's about this game. It's more about the social, bringing other villages in, bringing lots of people together into these villages in that sense. You know, and there probably was a game they played. There are certain things in these things that they share from one to another, you know, and there's balls. They found balls that they think were made for that game, you know, but we don't know much about it because it went out so early. There's nobody that remembers the rules to the game, you know, and there's no written language. So one of the things we know about it is there's some figurines that have been found down south of the border, and there's one that was found down that shows people playing the ball game, you know, and it's sort of similar to the Mesoamerican ball game, but like one of the things is that they're not using their hands; they use their sides, their hips, and they hit the ball around and slide, and But beyond that, we don't know. We just don't know. Until we build a time machine and we can go back in time. You're not going to find a ball court laying there with everybody laying around all around it and what was going on.
Where would you take a time machine? You have a flying time machine.
I'd like to go back and see some guys take out a mammoth. Some Clovis hunters hunt a mammoth.
Yeah.
That'd be so amazing. I mean, there's so many things. It'd be fun to see what Chaco looked like. Chaco Canyon. Oh my God. Imagine that. What a place. The amount of work that went into building that place. Whew. Have you ever been to Chaco Canyon?
I have.
Yeah. It's mind-boggling. Especially in the work you do, the amount of rock. They had to haul all those rocks to every single one of those villages to build them. And they're distinct. You go to this village here, this pueblo is built out of this color rock, and this pueblo is built out of a different color rock. You know what I mean? It's like, wow.
Can we provide some context? Can we share the story of this place for those listening that may not be super familiar?
Chaco Canyon is it's a site that's up in northeastern New Mexico. And Chaco was built by ancestral Puebloans. So the folks that went on to build, say, like Mesa Verde, and then the modern Puebloans are their ancestors. So Chaco is kind of a remote canyon, kind of out in the middle of sort of badlands. There's just doesn't seem like there's all that much out there, but it did have a nice little creek that ran down through the middle of this canyon, and they built, starting in probably in I don't know, 600, 700, somewhere sort of early in the sequence, they started building these multi-story pueblos, masonry, and with this architecture that is just exquisite. The big pueblo, the biggest one of all the pueblos there, is called Pueblo Benito, and I can't tell you how many rooms it has, but it's on its backside. It was, I believe, it went up to 5 stories tall, and the masonry is they're using the natural sandstone rocks that they're gathering from the ridges, the sides of the ridges around there, and they're stacking them, and they're using small little chips, little teeny pieces of sandstone as chinking between the rocks with very little mud mortar. They're using a little bit of mud mortar, but very little. And so they're building these walls, and when they're starting out, some of these walls are like, they're 10 feet across, and they gradually taper up 3 or 4 stories, 5 stories up, and they'll kick in a little bit for a floor, and then another one, and these walls are just exquisite. And it's amazing because they would have then been plastered over. So the people living in there wouldn't even have seen that nice masonry inside those walls. It would have been covered up. And then they had built kivas. So the modern Pueblos still use kivas, and these kivas are round ceremonial structures. And at Chaco, they had like great kivas, and these great kivas are monstrous. And the wood, so in Chaco Canyon, there are no forests there. So for the roofs, they were hauling logs. They were cutting logs from a couple different mountain ranges. And in some cases, they were easily carrying these logs over 100 miles to Chaco. And one kiva might take, thousands of logs to do the roof. They did not spare on this. And so they had work crews. They had to have work crews that were out gathering the rocks to build the walls. Work crews that were hauling the logs in. Work crews that were chopping the logs. And then there's all this wealth and all this, these things. So a lot of people are like, it's a ceremonial center, and that is pretty probably likely. There's a lot of, they have roads that radiate out from Chaco in all these different directions. And there are, we call them Chacoan outliers. There are structures built out along these roads and out into communities on the landscape way out from Chaco, and they would build these, we call them great houses. So they're going to be probably at least 2 to 3 stories tall, big multi-room things. These are things that would stand out on the landscape. And so they had this network of these things, with Chaco Canyon kind of being the center of this. And so there's a million ways to interpret all of this, but there are definitely some kind of an elite folks were sort of at the helm of all this. And there's some evidence that there were these folks that they were polydactyl, I believe that's the right word. They had 6 toes. So you see a lot of rock art with feet with 6 toes, a kick out on them. And so, and then it's thought that some of these folks were part of that the elite class that were kind of organizing people up to do this, because you don't just take a random village and build a thing like they're doing there. You got to have a lot of organization. You got to lay these things out ahead of time. It's remarkable. It's really, really remarkable. We know very little about it. But the Puebloans have stories about it, and it was. This is where I'm not going to go into that, because I don't know these stories very well. But there was some characters that were kind of head of this that at first everybody thought they were great, and then all of a sudden everybody decided, nope, these guys are not good, and that got dropped. Things changed, so it's pretty cool.
The story of Chaco.
Yeah.
Are you ever curious how alien archaeologists may react when they discover traces and remnants of our civilization? What would you hope they find? What do you think they would most marvel at?
Gosh, I really haven't thought about that. I think they would just be like, yay, there's somebody else. It's proof that other people made a run at it, a goal, with it. It would be cool, depending on what's left. The universe is such a huge place, and like the new telescope, that you can look so far back in time, and it unless there's some major technology changes, there's really not any ways that organisms can travel between distant worlds, at our technology level. But I think, I don't know, I kind of suspect that if we can imagine it, it can happen, It's like you look at what we have now compared to back when my dad was a kid. He was born in the 1920s or something, and he was at Pearl Harbor. He was in a ship off the coast, a troop transport. And, in his lifetime, the changes, and now look, we've got these cell phones, and at night you go outside and you look in the sky, and I remember as a kid it'd be like, oh wow, I can see a satellite. Oh, there's one. Now you go outside, you can't hardly see the stars for all the satellites everywhere. There's just satellites everywhere. It's like, whoa, and we just see this change going on in our lives. We don't even think about how fast this change is happening. All this stuff that back in the day, change was slow. In your lifetime, you might not even see it happening. And now, it's like, it just happens lightning speed, it's crazy. What's the next thing that's going to happen? I don't know. We're merging with digital technology, It's like, yikes.
What other resources do you have for those that may be generally interested in some of what we spoke about today?
They could go to our website at Archeology Southwest with all of our videos. There's a list that we put out on archaeology things that are happening, here and there around the Southwest. There's in that list, there's a compilation of websites that have videos out on on a lot of different things that are really exciting, cool. You can watch, see archaeologists talk about the different things they study and work on. Like the Marilyn Poole, who I was talking about, who does the lac stuff. She has a great video that the Ameren Museum put out about lac. So that's a great, because you can learn a lot. And I talk about it, but I don't understand lac anything near like what she does. So that's a great resource to go to.
And why is it important that people engage in the stuff that we've been talking about?
Well, I think the big thing is that the archaeology is a non-renewable resource. So the stuff that people did in the past, technology is changing. We don't do that anymore. So it's worth protecting because it's not the same. So we just keep moving on. But it ties people back to our origins, to the landscape, to outside, to back when we were living on the land, where we paid more attention to what we were doing to the land. So if we went out and we used up all of our resources over here, we're not going to be able to go back and do that. So we have to be careful and use a little bit here, a little bit there, so that when we come back next year, those things are going to still be there. And you probably learn that by doing it the hard way. But also, as populations get bigger and there's more people using those resources, technology has to change to deal with that, or you're going to have a bad winter and you're going to lose half your people or whatever, So it's, people lived at a certain scale for a long period of time. And it's only in the last 200 years that things are just going crazy.
There's parallels, for sure.
Yeah.
We've spoken for a little bit now. Do you have any final messages?
Oh yeah, come out and see me.
Yeah.
Something like that. Come out and see me. Come out. I'll be out next fall at events here in town. Steampunk Ranch, Mission Gardens. Check out I got some videos up on our YouTube channel at Archeology Southwest, and we put magazines out. We have these magazines. You can look at our website. There's all kinds of good information there.
Yeah, I can attest going out to visit Allan out at Mission Garden or Steampunk Ranch is a great hands-on experience. I'll make sure to put up links in the notes to some of the stuff we've talked about. If you have nothing else, that's a great note to end on. I think so.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Allan.
It is always a pleasure to find an opportunity to speak with Allan Denoyer. I encourage you to do the same. Next time you're in Arizona, take a trip to the past with Allan at his Hands-On Archaeology Day event hosted at Steampunk Ranch on the second Saturday and at Mission Garden on the fourth Saturday of each month. And let me assure you, there is nothing quite like stretching a raw buckskin by hand until dry with a motivated group of fellow humans. And do visit archeologysouthwest.org for more information, events, exhibits, classes, and ways to participate. As well, you'll find a blog full of interesting reading and video presentations. In addition, Southwest Archaeology produces a physical magazine. You'll find a link to their website in the show notes. So this program was created with intentions to curate resources for folks who are interested in participating in the efforts highlighted during the episode. But please do not wait for me to make your connection. Should you find that Steampunk Ranch be too long of a detour, then input the phrase, archeological and heritage associations near me into your search bar and tell me later where it takes you. And if you are still listening for whatever reason, please hear my sincere gratitude for being such a wonderful captive audience. Thank you. Wherever and whoever you are incredible. Take care. Be kind to yourself, everyone you love, and those in the world around you. Farewell.